Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, wherever you are in the world. I anticipate we have an international group. The Zoom has really fostered that. My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. We're here today to talk about sponsorship, but before we do that, I'm going to open it up to a couple people so we can have an introduction. This series, as well as another series, this is called the series of the Path to Freedom. It's an hour and a half, essentially. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Journey every month on some aspect of the step process. Obviously, in January, we started with step 1. So here we are now anticipating talking a little bit about step 12. And Melissa is going to introduce us to the retreat center. She's our retreat center liaison and coordinator today.
Thank you so much, Herb, for supporting the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center along with everyone here today on Zoom. Herb has been connected to the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center for many years, and he's truly a part of our family. His 12-step and centering prayer groups have been extremely popular at the Retreat Center for decades. And now, since the start of the pandemic, he has moved these popular offerings to Zoom. Herb's journey includes 7 years in Claretian Seminary, a graduate education in psychology, 40 years in human resources consulting, certification as a spiritual director, 37 years of active participation in a 12-step fellowship, and the publication of 3 books on spiritual awakening. So we are delighted that he's donating the proceeds of these Zoom gatherings to our retreat center during this difficult time. So thank you, everybody, for your generosity and your presence.
Thank you so much, Melissa. All right, so I'm going to put up a couple things and talk at the same time. I'm going to try this. I've got some thoughts and some PowerPoints and some notes. We're going to talk about sponsorship. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, since the word's not in the big book, but it certainly is in the culture. The big book was printed in 1939, first edition. The 12 and 12 was printed first edition in 1953. So in that 12 years, the word sponsor came into the program because the 12 and 12 is peppered with the word sponsor throughout. I'll talk a little bit about the background before 1939. I'm actually not sure how the word came into the culture and nor got codified in the 12 and 12. Someday I may know that. I'll talk a little bit about what is a sponsor, how to be a sponsor, finding a sponsor, being a sponsee. In these Path to Freedom series, I mentioned before we started recording, is an hour and a half workshop. Actually, it's more a presentation than a workshop. And right now, I hope you have a pen and paper. You will probably want to have pen and paper at some point during our time together. I'd like you now to write down your thoughts or experiences with what is a sponsor. Not necessarily who you are as a sponsor, but what your thoughts are about being a sponsor. There's no sponsor training. There's a pamphlet in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not aware of pamphlets in other fellowships, but there's a pamphlet in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is quite good, very small. It's questions and answers on sponsorship. You might have read it at some time. If you haven't, I really recommend it. It's quite good, succinct, and as it says, it's based on our experience. AA, of course, doesn't have any rules or regulations. They don't have any musts or dogma. But this is just questions and answers on sponsorship. There's no sponsor training. There are no sponsor job descriptions or profiles that are official anyway. It's on-the-job learning. Just your thoughts, your opinions, both thoughts and opinions about what qualifies a person to be a reasonably good sponsor. And we were talking informally before we started, and one of the participants made the comments concerning what had helped her in terms of questions being asked, not directions being given, not information being taught, but questions that she could incorporate as her question and then hold that question to come up with her own orientation, her own conclusion, or a continued question, which then she would have as a skeleton to hang the flesh of information and other people's experience on. The question's so much more important than the answer. Joe and Charlie introduced me to that phrase when they said, the book is filled with answers, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, filled with answers. But the best part is it's filled with questions. It changed the way I read the big book. And they said, you'll recognize the questions because there's a question mark at the end of the sentence. And I love the humor. They said, and treat the question mark as a stop sign. Stop. Just don't read and blow by it. Stop. Ask yourself the question. That question in step 1, many places. Am I really powerless? And what does that mean? Do I really not have a choice? I mean, no choice? In step 2 on page 53, God is or God isn't. What is your choice? In step 3, what is your decision? And the implied question. It's not as clear as I'm about to say it in step 3 on page 62 and 63. What is your decision for a relationship with power? A relationship. There's so much misinformation or misinterpretation of information. So the questions really help. And then, in fact, one of the men I was exposed to had this comment. It was his insight. Take actual statements in the big book, actual affirmative sentences, and turn them into a question. And even make it personal. Like the bedevilments on page 52. The behavioral description of step 1, unmanageability, the behavioral description. Is my life unmanageable? Turn those statements of bedevilments into personal present questions. If you want a litmus test for your spiritual condition, there's no better inventory process than taking those bedevilments, making them personal, me, making them present now, and turning that into a question. Quite frankly, that's a model for really good sponsorship, I believe, is helping people ask the right question. I went to a retreat up at the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center because it looked really wonderful and rich, and it was a human development, psychological retreat on men's spirituality. I read the description. I saw the co-facilitator. I thought it'd be really interesting. So I went up there. And on Friday night, the retreats there are Friday night, all day Saturday, Sunday till noon lunch. I went up there Friday night. You stay there, as Melissa mentioned. It's like Motel 6, really simple, but quite nice. The lights of the city are on one side and the panorama of the ocean is on the other side. It's a beacon on the hill. And I got there Friday night and the retreat facilitator asked us, well, why are you here? Oh my God. I mean, you might think that's such a simple question, but I had no idea why I was there, other than I wanted to go on retreat and it looked kind of interesting, but I had no real idea why I was there, what I expected, what I wanted, what I needed. And it gave me such energy for the balance of the retreat, because he asked that simple question that opened up my mind and opened up to my heart. Many of you have been with me before, and you know that the man who helped me with the steps in 1988, a story for another day, but we were sitting, getting to know each other at the very beginning, and after 30 or 40 minutes of my telling him about my background, because he'd asked the question, he said, Herb, you have to look at me now. You have a lot of information, but you have no transformation. You have a lot of academic knowledge, but it's never filtered through your heart to your feet behaviorally, and you have not changed. You have the delusion that you're a Renaissance man. In actuality, you're a Neanderthal. He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't being negative. He wasn't dismissing or denigrating me or shaming me. He was very cold, hard facts, objective, mirroring back to me what he saw. And he quoted Einstein. The consciousness that created the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves the problem. You've really filled and trained this with wonderful information, but it stayed there. And you think knowledge is power. Well, in one way it is, but not in behavioral way until you in fact incorporate it into your life, into your behavior, make it real and have an experience with it. I'm asking you to pray with me. You can pray out loud, or you can pray quietly, or you don't have to pray at all. It's your choice, of course. But I invite you to have an open mind and an open heart and make that commitment for the next hour. That's all. Just for the next 60 minutes. If you stay longer, of course, then I encourage you to keep that open mind and open heart. It's called the set aside prayer. Those, again, of you who have been exposed to me know that I've changed it periodically. It's not an official prayer. Very unofficial, very spontaneous, very tailored to circumstances. This one talks about the 12 steps. Many times I talk about the spiritual path, if it's a broader audience or a broader topic. But this particular series of the Path to Freedom is about the 12 steps. I'm doing a monthly series starting in January with step 1, collapsing some of the steps like 5, 6, and 7 into one session because I expanded the approach to step 4 into 2 sessions. There's an awful lot of material there. All of that's recorded, edited, and on my YouTube. Recently, this year, for the workshop, thinking about how to perhaps fine-tune and improve the approach I'm using. I replaced the word brokenness with unmanageability, since that's the second half of the first step. And I've come in the last couple years, at least, to comment that that's the best kept secret in the rooms, unmanageability. What is it? Really seriously, what is it? How does it look? And how do you deal with it? It's really the major part of what I consider the step process to be. More about that later. Please join me, if you care to, out loud or quietly in the set-aside prayer, or at least be committed to having the gift of an open mind and open heart. God, please set aside everything I think I know about myself, my unmanageability, the 12 steps in you, for an open mind, and a new experience with myself, my unmanageability, the 12 steps, and especially you. The whole process of the 12 steps was a response by Bill Wilson, primarily. He wrote the big book. Yes, it was written by group conscience, which means that he wrote the big book in draft form, chapter by chapter, and passed it around to those with long-term sobriety. In 1938, when he was writing the book, long-term sobriety was defined as 6 months. Yeah. Well, AA had just started June 10th of 1935. Bill got sober in December of 1934. And I'm going to talk about that because it's so relevant to this concept of sponsorship, the bondage of addiction. But that's not really the problem. Oh, it's a problem, as I've mentioned many times before. But the problem is unmanageability. That's, for me, the focus, the bullseye of the 12-step program. Bill calls it a way of life. Yes, the first 9 steps are for the deflation of the ego at death. That's the program of recovery. Absolutely, a program of recovery. It's guaranteed. That word guarantee is not in the big book, but the word recovered is. Take a look at the second title page in your big book. The first title page has the title, Alcoholics Anonymous. That's all it has on it. But you turn to that second page. It's a title page that has a lot more writing on it. It says how many thousands of men and women have recovered. All right. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, and I pray that you don't, especially publicly in meetings, because it's not about being right and it's not about being semantics. It's about understanding, however, what does that mean, recovered? After we finish the 9th step, they give us some promises on page 84. Those promises are concluded, and it says there, we enter the world of the spirit. Well, if you're going to be asking questions, there's one. We enter the world of the spirit. Well, where the hell have we been if we're just now at the end of the 9th step, entering the world of the spirit? We're entering the world of, we've come out of the world of self. Step 1 through 9 is for the deflation of the ego at depth. But as Dr. Tebow observed, he wasn't an alcoholic. He was a psychiatrist connected to Bill for various reasons at the time of the development of AA. And he said, Bill got it right. Steps 1 through 9 are for the deflation of the ego at depth. But the ego has an uncanny way of regenerating itself. That's the unmanageability right there. The ego's uncanny innate, intrinsic, subtle regeneration of itself. Bill says there, we're placed in a position of neutrality. The implication is with regard to our addiction. Those are the words, we are placed in a position of neutrality. Here the grace, we are placed, but here the promise, a position of neutrality. Neutrality, there's no resistance, there's no white knuckles. There's no vigilance and effort on our part in terms of our addiction. There is certainly vigilance on our part with regard to our unmanageability. And that's how he opens it up to step 10. Watch for resentment and fear and dishonesty and selfishness. Because we're also in the bondage of unmanageability. He says we're not cured. What does that mean? Daily reprieve. What does that mean? Well, we might unpack some of that today, but that's not my intent today. I'm just raising the questions. The model that I use, based on both my understanding of psychology as well as my knowledge of spirituality, I studied to be a Catholic priest for 7 years in a monastery, and I studied to be a psychologist, getting my graduate education in psychology, never becoming a psychologist. But I have that background and that interest. And when I came to the 12 steps, after finishing a journey of 3 times through the steps, beginning in 1988, I may not have said it, but I got sober. I was given the gift of sobriety in 1984, February. Again, a story for a different day. I don't want to use our time that way. But in 1988, I was sitting with that man. You have a lot of information, but no transformation. And he took me through the steps, and I had a power out of the big book for the very first time with very precise instructions because he was a mechanic. He wasn't my sponsor. I never engaged him as my sponsor. He was a mechanic and a project manager. I asked him to help me go through the steps. When we were finished with the steps a year later, 12 months, finishing step 12, it wasn't a step a month, but it took 12 months to finish the 12 steps. In the sense of my understanding of 10, 11, and 12, understanding them and then implementing them and using them on a daily basis as the way of life for the balance of my life. I had a spiritual awakening. Some of that might come out today. Most of it won't. But I had powerful experiences with step 1, step 4, step 6 and 7, steps 8 and 9, and especially step 11. Did you notice that I didn't say every step? It's just my experience. I had a sponsor. I engaged that sponsor when I came into the program in February of 1988. And he had uncommon common sense. He was a friend of mine who got sober 12 years earlier. He had a background like mine, Irish Catholic, in the same business that I was, married with children like I was. So we had a lot of identification, and plus we were good friends. I really trusted him. And he agreed to be my sponsor on the condition that I would go to a meeting every day. I said, Lloyd, I'm really busy, especially now with this recovery business. He said, well, if you can't go to a meeting every day, I won't sponsor you. That was it, black and white. He didn't have any rules, but if I wasn't going to follow his suggestion, he wasn't going to work with me. That modeled sponsorship. Do you know I found time to go to a meeting every day? Sometimes twice a day, because I was in deep, deep trouble at work, a career that I had relished, that I was, after 20 years, about to get fired from. And he helped guide me navigate that over the next 4 years. I did these steps in 1988, and I resigned from that job because I had changed, but the environment that I was in could never release me from the 17 years of drunken mayhem, and didn't understand that I had changed. And quite frankly, I had not changed. I quit drinking in 1984, but I didn't change me and my behavior until 1988 as a result of this step work. That's the whole point of a spiritual awakening. My sponsor was a really good man and a really good sponsor and a really good sounding board. But that part of sponsorship, which I believe is critical, and the central purpose of being a sponsor, which is to take somebody through the steps out of the big book, he didn't have the competency to do that. And he didn't know that he didn't. He thought because he read 2 pages of the big book every day and he went to a meeting every day that he was to be a competent person to take me through the steps. He said, get a big book and read it and work the steps. Get a big book is good advice. Read it is really good advice. Work the steps is not so good when you don't guide the person through the steps. But he did with me what had been done with him, and he didn't know any better. And of course, being a newbie, I didn't know anything. Step 1, well, I'm in AA, and look at all of the drama. I must be an alcoholic. That was my step 1. Steps 2 and 3, don't you know I was a monk for 7 years of silence? Give me a break. Steps 2 and 3, in the big book, a bit juvenile by my standards, reading and not understanding. So I went to step 4. I couldn't understand the big book. I read the 12 and 12. It's a commentary. There are no directions. I did the Hazelton literature. I did the hospital literature. I looked at the questionnaires from various meetings and the approaches of various people on step 4, and I got even more confused. And the man said, oh, Herb, write an autobiography. You know, I used to think that that was very lame, because my experience with it was pretty lame at the time, especially by measurement later on, as I got some very specific direction on step 4. But it actually was probably implied by the big book in step 5. It says we tell someone all, and it's in italics. When the big book uses italics, that's the big book's way of highlighting. We tell someone all our life story. Life story. So an autobiography can be quite sufficient and effective if, in fact, there's a little bit more given to in the instructions than just write your story. Because what I did is I wrote a script. I did this, I did that, I had some guilt, I had some shame, I might have hurt somebody here, blah, 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 blah. No insight, no in-depth. Step 4 in the big book asks us to look at the underlying causes and conditions. Underlying causes and conditions, not the external behaviors, although we look at the behaviors to dig down underneath to get to the underlying causes and conditions. When I did the steps with this man, Jerry, in 1988, I began to see the truth about the lies. I began to understand my values. I began to see my corrupt motives. I began to know that I needed to identify principles in me and principles that I wanted to have in me in order to live a decent life. None of that with my graduate education in philosophy, my graduate education in theology, and my graduate education in psychology, none of that had ever come to light for me. As I said, I had that information, but it had never been transferred into practical application. So I have come up with the things that the components for step one, based on my experience with the steps of the human being having a body and a mind and a will. A body that is subject to allergy. No, I mean literally physical, chemical allergy. That's what the doctor's opinion is. He's a medical doctor, Dr. Silkworth. He says we have an allergy. Now he's using it as a metaphor, not as science. Today we know that science is there. The liver of an alcoholic is different. 1 out of 10 people do not process alcohol like 9 out of 10 people do. It may be the same for process addiction. It may be the same for other substance addictions like drugs and food, but it's confirmed science now, as I understand it. I'm not a scientist, but I read science. But the body doesn't make us human. What does make us human? That we have a mind that is self-conscious, that is reflective. We know that we know, and we can stand outside ourselves and watch ourselves. No other sentient being can do that. And that we have free will. Civilization's built on that. I can make a choice. I can turn left, I can turn right. I can show up for this workshop. There are people that register for this workshop that are not here today. There are thousands of people that read the flyer that didn't register. But you not only registered, but you showed up. You made that choice. See, we have free will. But the big book says unmanageability is the second half of the first step. Powerless and no choice. That's what I had to see in those bedevilments and the description in pages 60 to 62, the exact nature of and description of unmanageability. Short summary, self will run riot. Each step, just like I outlined the first step, is built on these 3 parts. It's really helped me to see that all of the even steps are knowing steps. All of the odd steps are decision and action steps. That may not have any meaning or implication for you. For me, it helped me understand and apply each step, and then understand and apply the steps overall. Listen to how Bill Wilson ends the 11th step. Praying for the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry it out. Because we lots of times know better and don't do better. That's the definition of unmanageability: restless, irritable, and discontent. 1 year sober, 5 years sober, 20 years sober, but not free of addiction, but not free of unmanageability. Either because we don't understand it, or if we understand it, we don't know how to deal with it, or if we know how to deal with it, we don't deal with it. There's so many levels for us. My free will is not free, but I had to learn that. What is free and what is not free, and what is the solution to freedom? How do you deal with it? Bill asks that question many times, not the least of which is on, I think it's page 60. Page 60. We turn our will and our life over to the care of God. What do we mean by that, and how do we do that? What do we mean by that? For our mind to know, What do we do about it? For our will to make a decision and take an action. Amazing stuff. The internal integrity of the big book is awesome. So I have adopted Maslow's hierarchy of needs approach to how human beings are constructed, because how we're constructed really reveals how we can deal with the defects in the structure or in the behavior from the structure. So I don't give him credit on the slide, but I give it verbal to him because I've adopted his and I've changed it so that I don't want to put his name on it. This is about human development, critical for your own personal understanding as to the integration of all of the moving parts of you. And then, of course, where you can help other people and ask them questions about the various parts. I think this is the role of sponsorship. Are you getting enough sleep? That's the role, I believe, of a sponsor, is to challenge somebody's understanding of and practice of good habits, living habits. Most of the men that come to me have really warped ideas about what it means to be a man, as well as more deeply what it means to be a human being. I send many of the men that I work with to that human development eating program, Weight Watchers. Not because they have a weight problem, although some of them do. Not because they have a food problem, although some of them do, but because they're ignorant with regard to quality food, quantity of food, good eating habits. They're just ignorant, either from their family of origin or from their lifestyle. My current cause du jour, and I probably have said that for 20 years, because it's been a long time, a cause du jour is sleep. Especially today with the technology that we have and the stress in our lives. Well, what's enough sleep? The jury's in, the science is conclusive. It's not arguable, and you're not different, probably. There might be 1 or 2% of you that are an exception to what I'm about to say, but most of us need 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep consistently daily. If you're not getting it, you're sleep deprived. Oh, you might be functional by your standards, but you're not healthy in terms of an integrated and conscious approach to life. If you're sleep deprived, as they do with POWs, you're compensating in some way, maybe through eating, maybe through working, maybe through tension or anger or anxiety. If you're not getting enough sleep, you're not living a quality life. So I start with the basics. What about emotional sobriety? As most of you know, I'm doing quite a bit of work with Dr. Alan Berger. He's a clinical psychologist, PhD, and he's 50 years sober. 50 years this year, August. He turned 50 years sober. He got sober at like 19. And we came across together the letter to Bill Wilson to a depressed person in 1956, which was published in the Grapevine in 1958. And Bill Wilson calls emotional sobriety the next frontier. Well, if you read the 12 and 12, which was written when Bill was about 20 years sober, probably, the book is peppered with the word emotional sobriety. It's not in the big book, 1939, but 1953, it's almost every chapter has emotional sobriety as words, let alone the implications in the 12 and 12. Because Bill understood that you need to get physical sobriety, of course, and then ride that horse for a while. And then eventually, if you're growing, we enter the world of the Spirit, he says, as he begins step 10, our job is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. I hope you're hearing what I'm saying, because this is the basic human structure. We have a brain stem. We have 3 brains. The brain stem manages our biological, physiological instincts: fight, flight, and freeze, survival instincts. Our limbic system, the next brain up, the second brain, manages our emotions: anger, fear, and dishonesty or shame. They come right out of the instincts. It's a wonderful model to unpack step 4, which is, of course, the behavioral manifestations of instincts and emotions that are corrupted. Anger turns into resentment. Fear turns into fear and anxiety. And dishonesty turns into shame and inappropriate sexual behavior. What I'm modeling here is that there are some basics for a sponsor to understand about themselves and about human beings. I didn't get any of this from my philosophy and my theology and my psychology. Oh, I got lots of information, but it was never integrated. I got this from doing the steps 3 different times over a 10-year period. In 1988, I understood the body part, the allergy part. In 1991, I had a whole new experience with the addiction as obsession and delusion. I understood the mind part. And then thank God for my third journey through the steps in 1994 with a man. It took 2 years to go through. We went very contemplatively because I wasn't being driven by pain. I was being motivated by more virtue, more strength, more enlightenment, more transformation, more consciousness, more spiritual awakening. All synonyms for what the promises are the 12th step, which then helped me with my relationships. So I've changed this model to include the step 10 development of emotional sobriety as self-actualization and the development of conscience. Bill says, watch for what we saw in the 4th step: resentment, fear, dishonesty, and selfishness. Watch for it. Pay attention to the words in the big book, page 84. Excuse me, is that right? Yeah, 84. Watch for. He says when they crop up. He doesn't say if. You see, we're human beings. Dr. Tebow, as I quoted earlier, said the ego deflation takes place in steps 1 through 9, but the ego has an uncanny way of regenerating itself. And Bill codifies that, giving a lot of clarity to step 10 in the 12 and 12. A very misunderstood tool of emotional sobriety, step 10. In the 12 and 12, he says it's a spiritual axiom. Whenever we're disturbed, there's something wrong with us. I heard it in my 2nd year of recovery. I didn't like it, but I began to appreciate it. But after I did the 4th step, 2 years later, and unpacked the underlying causes and conditions, and had this conversion experience that I'm not a victim, I'm the perpetrator. I don't have a part in my resentment. I hope you can hear this. I don't have a part in my resentment. I have it 100%. There is no other part. It's 100% my reaction to people and circumstances. And step 10 is when I'm disturbed, I need to number 1, be aware that I have that feeling, that negative feeling of disturbance, and then to take the appropriate action to deal with it. That's emotional sobriety. That's returning to being in alignment with reality as it's manifesting. Emotional sobriety is simply accepting reality. The attitude of acceptance and the action of rebalancing. That's emotional sobriety. Now, Alan Berger's written an entire book on it, just recently published, called Emotional Sobriety, the best book he's written. I recommend it if you're ready for it. Short chapters, wonderful reading, lots of psychological insights woven into his 50 years of recovery in the 12-step process. But in 1988, 4 years sober, this man helped me understand what meditation is. Now, I'm a 7-year trained monk. I mean, it'd been 25 years since I'd done any meditation. When I left the monastery, I hung up my black robe, which monks wear. And when you wear a robe, then you meditate because you're a monk. You take the robe off, you're not a monk, so you don't meditate. Well, that was my logic, unconscious as it was. But it tells you, it reveals, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know the value of it. I didn't have any connection to the benefit of meditation. 25 years later, in 1988, this man is explaining to me about meditation. I'm not going to take the time now, but the code was we ask God to direct our thinking, and then we begin thinking, listening to our thinking. Listening to our thinking is not in the big book, but it's the implication. This man had experience, so he was able to translate it into instructions to me. Listen to your thinking as an answer to your prayer. God, please direct my thinking. The big book says, now think and consider. And this man gave me the interpretation. Listen. Well, I've heard it all the time, and so have you in the rooms. Prayer is when I'm talking to God. Meditation is when I'm listening to God. I had no idea what that meant. It sounded good on the surface. It sounded very simple on the surface. And it is good and simple. It's just not surface. It's deep, sophisticated understanding of human behavior as well as the practice of meditation. Listen, not with my ears. I've never heard God speak through audibly to me, but that tiny whispering sound, by the way, which is the correct translation. It's not the wee small voice. That's nice. It's just not accurate. The actual translation from the original Aramaic, I don't do that. I read about it from other people who know the language, is tiny whispering sound. That may sound similar, and it is, but it's subtly different and not so subtle when you actually appreciate the difference. The tiny whispering sound. Self-realization is step 11, and then step 12 is compassion. And one of the words I used in the flyer talking about this workshop today is compassion. I looked it up. We hear it all the time. The dictionary is the best companion to the big book. The dictionary is the best companion to understanding words. Spend some time in the dictionary looking up the words that you think that you know. And it will give you some of the roots of where the words come from, which then gives you a lot more understanding of the depth of the implication of the word. Compassion comes from the Latin passio, which means suffering. Suffering. And calm in Latin means with. Compassion is I connect to another person's suffering and I suffer with them. It's not the same as their suffering, but it has that same implication of empathy. Empathic, pathos, still the same word, suffering, feelings, emotions. Those last three levels of human development are what make us specifically human. that we're aware that we're aware. Paying attention. Step 10. That we're improving this awareness in step 11. And that we're enlarging our own human spirit. I'm using that word very intentionally. Enlarging our human spirit. I'll talk more about that in a minute. I use the word improve in step 11 because it's in the step itself. But I use the word enlarge in terms of step 12, that sponsorship role, that living a life on principles role, that being awake and staying awake and supporting and fostering our awakenedness role. Bill has it in the big book, but you had to surface it by connecting a couple dots, which I'll do in a little bit. You've heard it many times. Are we a human being seeking a spiritual experience, or are we a spiritual being seeking a human experience? And if you've been around me for a while, you know it's not a trick question. And the answer is yes. Yes, both. Yes. Depends on what you mean by spiritual. What do I mean by spiritual? I mean relationship. Is God necessary? Actually not. I mean the word G-O-D. Of course, the big book is based on the assumption that there is a power that's necessary. Bill uses a synonym, higher power. But he also in the 12 and 12 says, if you have any trouble, like you're the agnostic and or atheist that chapter 4 is addressed to in the big book, we agnostics, if that's your resistance and or concern or belief, he says in the 12 and 12, choose the group. They have something that you don't have that you want. At the very least, sobriety, at the very most, happiness. Addiction, first half of the first step, sobriety. Unmanageability, the second half of the first step, happiness, freedom. A life of contentment and harmony. Is God necessary? Well, you have to determine what the name of the power is for you. That's the whole intent of chapter 4. Page 53. God is or God isn't. What is your choice? We are confronted with the question of faith. Oh my goodness, look at the big book. We are confronted with the question of faith. I confronted at 10 years of sobriety with this man who gave me the set-aside prayer, who introduced me to the bedevilments as unmanageability, the living problem, the human problem, unmanageability. The first two step guides and my own sponsor had never introduced me to the concept of understanding unmanageability. It was progressive. But it changed my approach to steps 2 and 3. Up to that point, I had the God of my tradition, of my understanding, of my theology training. And when I did the steps this third time in 1994 with the set-aside prayer and a couple questions in step 2 that cracked it open, I was able to see that my concept of God was the very impediment to my relationship with the mystery. I hope you're hearing that. My concept is interesting, but irrelevant. My relationship is the only thing that counts. My relationship with this power, that's what step 3 is about. Made a decision to turn, to have this relationship with a caring, fill in the blank. What is it that you believe? He asked me, and I wrote out a theological treatise that was just poetically beautiful and publishable, quite frankly. And a week later, he asked me to write out how I behaved in light of that wondrous essay. and I could see the conflict. There was no connection between my head and my feet, as I mentioned earlier, even at 10 years of sobriety, with regard to steps 2 and 3. And I was able then, based on having all that set aside, to have a new experience. And my concept of God and my relationship with the mystery has changed pretty regularly. Those of you who have been exposed to me have heard the vocabulary change over time. I'm currently using the word flow with a capital F. I'm in the flow and I am the flow. I'm not God, but I am not God. Those of you who've heard me unpack steps 2 and 3 this year, perhaps in the Path to Freedom series. And if you want to know more about that, I did a couple hours on that. It's a marvelous process of exploration and confrontation and a decision that leads you to taking some different kinds of actions. It's the underpinning, of course, of step 11. We have a wonderful history. Carl Jung was the first one to tell us that we needed a spiritual experience. He told Roland Hazard, I can't help you. This was way before AA or Bill Wilson. 1932, perhaps. As a result of that encounter, Bill calls Carl Jung the spiritual father of Alcoholics Anonymous. Frank Buckman set it up for Roland Hazard to find a process that gave him the spiritual experience, and that was the Oxford group in New York. And then, of course, Bill Wilson got exposed to Dr. Silkworth, who helped him understand about the problem of the allergy of the body and the obsession of the mind. This confluence, as you can see, early 30s. The dates may be not quite accurate, but they're fairly accurate in terms of the confluence of Bill Wilson getting exposed to this material. These are the original contributors to what Bill wrote in the Big Book in terms of his experience with the 6 steps of the Oxford group. Roland reached out to Abby Thatcher. Roland was Abby Thatcher's sponsor. Abby Thatcher reached out to Bill. You can read on page 13, he went to the hospital. Bill had been going to the Oxford group for a while, usually drunk. But then Abby heard he was in the hospital in December of 1934. That was his 3rd hospitalization that year. September, November, and now December. And on page 13 in the Big Book, he helps him go through the steps in the hospital bed his 2nd day, December 12th. He went into the hospital December 11th, December 12th. Abby shows up that 2nd day of hospitalization. Bill's still detoxing. They review the steps. This is the Oxford group steps. It's on page, I think, 263 in the 4th edition of the Big Book. Complete deflation, dependence and guidance, moral inventory, confession, restitution, continued work with others. Bill was in the hospital bed. Of course, he didn't do his restitution or work with others, but he did the balance of it. And it went like this. Bill, are you defeated? Yes, I'm in the hospital for the 3rd time. I'm going to go insane or die. Bill, do you believe in God? Yes. Bill, let's talk about your history and all your corruption and mischief. I'm being kind. And Bill did it spontaneously, gave him his 4th step in, a 5th step right there. And Bill made up his mind. It's very much commented on in the Big Book that when he got out, he was going to do the restitution, and that the next day he had his spiritual experience. December 13th, his third day in hospitalization, the day after he worked the steps, in his own heart, he was lifted to the height of a mountain, he said. A white light appeared and filled the room. He felt as if he'd been brought to the top of a mountain. And a clean wind blew through him. And at the end of that 20-minute period, he was completely convinced that alcohol had been removed from him as it had been, complete neutrality, and that his life's work was to try to help other people have an experience like that to get rid of their alcohol problem. Pretty amazing. Bill didn't know what happened to him. Somebody brought him the book, William James's book, Varieties of Religious Experience, and Bill was able to understand what his experience was. And then when he was doing his own work later on with some experience, he crafted the steps that turned out to be 12 steps. The first 3 being a relationship with power. The next 4, a relationship with yourself. The next 2, a relationship with others. My definition of spirituality is relationship. A relationship with reality in those 3 areas. A power other than ourselves. Notice I'm not using the word God or spirit. Those are interpretations which you're welcome to have. But I want to neutralize it to the point where what Bill intended. It was a power other than ourselves, other than human power. You figure it out for yourself. You don't need to be told what to do. You don't need to take it from your sponsor, from the big book, from your 12-step fellowship, from your parents, from the Bible, from the psychologist, or from the world. You figure it out. You make your decision. You talk about freedom. You talk about personalization. And then a relationship with the true self. That deflation of the ego at depth, so that my false self, this Hollywood storefront, this mask that was my survival protection, which I didn't know that I wore until I identified it in step 4, several different aspects of it over time, thanks to people who were my step guides. My sponsor was wonderfully helpful. I had that sponsor for 28 years until he moved out of town based on retirement. I believe in local sponsorship where I can sit face to face. In COVID, Zoom, although we still met face to face. He's a fellow who takes care of himself as I do, so I felt very safe in meeting with him. Once a month. That's the level of the sponsorship I have today. We don't talk much in between. We don't have any need to. And then my relationships rehabilitated with others through steps 8 and 9. If you want to watch a very intense but very revealing and wonderful workshop I did recently is with Fred Luskin on forgiveness. He's a clinical psychologist, a professor at Stanford, and he wrote the book, literally wrote the book on forgiveness. It's called Forgive for Good. The process of steps 4 through 9 is about forgiveness as I've experienced it. That's why he and I are teaming up. We'll be doing another workshop in February 12th. Digging down deeper into that process of forgiveness. He calls it the nuts and bolts of it. But then it's our way of living. Steps 1 through 9 could be one and done. Not my experience, but there are plenty of people who say you do the steps once and then you live rigorously in 10, 11, and 12. Well, good for them. I obviously don't live rigorously in 10, 11, and 12 because periodically I have to redo the steps. I haven't done the steps since 2003. So obviously my 10, 11, and 12 are becoming more rigorous. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. We tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Well, that's not the way it was in a manuscript, the pre-publication manuscript. In the pre-publication manuscript, which gives us a sense of the carrying the message, much broader than what you see on the screen right now. It said, having had a spiritual experience, not awakening, having had a spiritual experience as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics. Well, I'm glad that they fine-tuned it for the sense of a singleness of purpose, but it reveals to us the original thinking, the spirit. And that's why Bill, in the preface to the first edition, you can read it in your big book. The preface is in there, that first paragraph, the last sentence of that first paragraph. And besides, our way of living may have its advantages for all. You see, this is a message for all humanity, for all individuals. As it turns out, Bill changed the word spiritual experience that was in the original first printing to spiritual awakening, and then put Appendix 2 in the back of the book to explain it. They're the same thing. Spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are identical in terms of the result, the product. A change in the way we think and feel and behave. A change in the way we think and feel and behave. Those components that make us specifically human. That's done to us, but not without us. Let me do that a little bit different. It's done to us, but not by us, but not without us. I actually added that line about 5 years ago because I realized it was incomplete. This is grace and willingness, that connection. There's so much to talk about. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, I think, in my commentary, because I do want to talk about that early development of sponsorship. I have already indicated that the sequencing in sponsorship was Carl Jung, Roland Hazard, Ebby, Bill, Bob. Bill Wilson reached out to Bob. It's a great story. So Bill is 6 months sober. He's had that mountaintop experience. He's trying desperately to bring somebody into recovery. He's going to the Oxford group meetings, which is a source of support. But then he's going to the hospitals and the jails and the asylums and wherever else he can go to find. He even went into saloons and dragged people off the bar stools. But after 6 months, nobody's sober. And Bill's been invited to go to Akron on a business trip. And he's looking at Lois and he's saying, you know, I misinterpreted my spiritual awakening, my hot flash. I've misinterpreted it because nobody's gotten sober. I'm going to give it up and go back to Wall Street so that you don't have to work so hard. So Lois, be assured, when I come back from Akron, I'm going to give up all of this business with helping drunks. I'm going to go back to Wall Street and we'll be okay again, because nobody, I must have misinterpreted it. Nobody has gotten sober. And Lois paused and looked up at him and said, Bill, you are. That's a moment of grace. This untreated Al-Anon captures what Bill says in chapter 7, that very first line. Nothing will so much ensure immunity as intensive work with another alcoholic. Immunization. Well, Bill got it. So he runs over to Dr. Silkworth to let him know that he's had this insight that he stayed sober because he tried to help other people, even though they didn't get it. And then Dr. Silkworth gave him a second piece of essential information. Bill, stop talking about your hot flash, your mountaintop mystical experience. People don't want to hear that. It scares them off. They think you're cuckoo. Talk about the allergy and the phenomenon of craving. Talk about the obsession and the delusion. When you start, you cannot stop. And when you stop, you cannot stay stopped. That's the message that will get their attention, your experience, where they can identify with it. Well, you have to, I hope you're hearing it the way I'm delivering it, the way it happened, because then Bill goes to Akron. Well, meanwhile, what we don't know is, and we know now, is Bob is a drunk. Bob Smith, a doctor, a surgeon in a hospital, but he's a member of the Oxford group. He goes to the Oxford group meeting every week, and they meet in Henrietta Seiberling's home. And every week they sit in a circle and they pray and they talk and they review their step work out of the Oxford group. And every week Bob goes home and gets drunk. 2.5 years before Bill ever visits with Bob. And 2 weeks before Bill comes to Akron, Henrietta is really tired of Bob's secret. At least Bob thinks it's a secret. Nobody else does. So she is very manipulative, quite frankly, person, but very well intentioned. And so she asks the group if tonight, after prayer, each one of them would share a secret that they've never shared with the group before. You see, she's trying to out Bob. Well, everybody shared. Bob was the last to share. And he said, I've got a secret that I'm a problem drinker. It really is interfering with my life. Now, I don't believe anybody laughed or commented, but everybody knew. And finally, it's out in the open. And Henrietta, here's the message. Henrietta said, would you like us to pray with you for relief? And he says, yes, please. They did. They held hands. They prayed for Bob's healing. This is 2 weeks before Bill gets to Akron. Bill's in the Mayflower Hotel, pacing up and down, tempted to go into the bar, knows consciously that if he goes there, he's going to be drinking again. He just knows intuitively, for whatever reason, why he was that conscious about it. And he says, I've got to call somebody now, because he's heard Lois work with another person. He's heard Dr. Bob share your experience. And I've got to call somebody. So after several calls, he finally gets connected to Henrietta. He says, I'm a drunk from New York. I'm in the Oxford group, and I'd like to meet another drunk that's in the Oxford group that needs help. I just can't help getting emotional. Henrietta said, we've been expecting you. The level of confidence in her Oxford group purpose and practice. We've been expecting you. Well, they tried to set up a meeting. Of course, Bob was drunk, and they set it up for the next day. And Bob, who was very resistant, said, I'm going to give him 15 minutes. Well, the meeting, as probably most of you know, lasted 5 hours. And because Bill, in a private conversation with Bob, was able to share his experience of the allergy and his experience of the obsession, his experience of powerless as no choice, his experience of the application of the Oxford group steps in a practical way. You see, Bob had a lot of information, but he had never really applied it because he thought it was a willpower issue. He thought it was a knowledge issue. He thought it was an effort issue, a moral issue. And Bill was there to tell him it's not about your lack of knowledge. It's not about your lack of willpower. It's not about your moral anything. And he was able to share his experience and have Bob be very aware of his own powerless and no choice. Now, it's interesting that Bill went to live with Bob for the next 3 months and learned a little bit more about meditation from Anne, who was both of their teachers, about meditation, sitting in guidance. And Bob and Bill didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how it worked, but Bill remembered what he had done. So they both agreed, let's go out and try to help somebody. Notice they went out to help somebody, sponsorship. They reached out. A very proactive process. They reached out to the hospitals and the asylums and the jails. Perhaps Jim's story on page 35 to 37 represents one of the examples of going to the asylum. Perhaps Fred's story after the jaywalker's story. I think it's page 41, 40, something like that. Is their outreach to the hospital where they met Fred and met him again a year later. They didn't give up on Jim. He relapsed 6 times. He went to the insane asylum 6 times. 6 times they sat down with him. They didn't throw him away. You're not serious when you're willing, when you're real serious, when you wanted enough. They didn't do none of that. They said, tell us, what's going on? What's going on? Tell us what's going on. And Fred, a year later, they're visiting the hospital and Fred's there again. Finally, they found the third person who finally got traction. Bill Dodson, Bill D. I do want to talk some specifics about sponsorship, and I will in a minute. The pamphlet I mentioned from AA, the GSO pamphlet is that pamphlet there. I'm not sure I mentioned, I don't think I did. The best reference from my standpoint is the book from Hazelton, 12-Step Sponsorship by Hamilton B. I've read it 3 times over a 20-year period because it's just solid, experiential, practical, how to be a sponsor, how to be a sponsee. And so I really like it. And the original sponsor function was twofold in AA 1935 when Bill and Bob sort of were feeling their way along. And that was, number one, usually they were very low bottom drunks. So they needed some hospitalization detox, and hospitals didn't like them because they didn't have insurance and they didn't pay. And so the role of a sponsor into the hospital was a person who would sign that they would take financial responsibility for the person. And so it was a big deal. It wasn't expensive like today, but by those standards, it was, of course, challenging, just coming out of the Depression. So that was the first sort of role. I sponsor you into the hospital. The other was very reminiscent of the Prohibition speakeasy days, that the anonymity fear of disclosure and public shame was so high that they kept it anonymity at an incredibly tight level so that you couldn't find an alcoholic and you couldn't find a meeting. So the only way you could get into a meeting is if somebody knocked on the door and they were with you and they said, I vouch for Fred, he can come in. It's kind of like, the movie from the Prohibition days. Yeah, anyway, that's the level of sponsorship. And then, of course, they had the Oxford group meetings in homes. So the very stereotypical, but true in those days, the women and the men came to the house for a meeting, the men being the drunks, the women being the married or partner person to the man. I mean, this is stereotypical and classical back in the day. And the women would sit in the living room having coffee and whatever, and the men would go upstairs to have a meeting. And if there was a new person there, they would say, Bob, are you a drunk? Yes. Do you believe in God? Yes. Get on your knees and give yourself to God. Thank you. Go in that room there, write your inventory, and we'll wait. Yeah. No, that's how they did it. It was like you left that house going to make amends. It wasn't a year-long workshop like we do, but then it developed into some workshops where they did sort of a assembly line after the Ford motor concept. Actually, they divided the steps into threes, and they had 4 weeks. And somebody who had just finished the workshops concluded it themselves. They would facilitate the next workshop. And they would do for the first 3 steps, then they would do the next 3 steps, then they would do the next 3 steps, and then they would do the next 3 steps. And in 1 month, you finish the steps. All right. Of course, it evolved over time where there is no official sponsorship or sponsorship training or even official literature about that. But one of my acquaintances, Wally P., developed his process called Back to Basics, which is in fact trying to get people through the steps in a weekend or in 4 weeks. And he has a book named that, Back to Basics. It's wonderful. I really, really like people to go through the steps very fast first, to get a panoramic view of them, to get a big picture of them, to get some experience with them. You might do a very, very minimum and superficial 4th step. Sure, okay. But as long as you're being guided by somebody who knows what they're doing, you're not going to make too many mistakes, but you're going to get somebody through. But if you really want to work the steps, I believe it's going to take, I've never had a person take less time than 3 months. And this was a young college man, finished college, had the summer off and had a real problem and wanted to finish it before he went to graduate school. He finished the steps in 3 months. I mean, every day he was on it. Yeah, it was very challenging. But anyway, most people take anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. I had one man take 10 years to do his steps. He took 5 years to do his 4th step. I don't recommend that, but that was his path, which then leads me to some of the other comments. Chapter 7 is the blueprint. Bill tells us how to meet somebody, what to talk about, how to deal with them. In a very, of course, is written in 1938, published in 1939. So it's very practical from his standpoint. But of course, we've got lots more experience since then. The men who took me through the steps, and I'm going to just give I think it's called a collage of their comments to me. I will work no harder than you work. That was the theme from every one of them. I will work as hard as you do, but no harder. I don't want it more than you, all right? You need to want it. I will meet you where you're at. This was information from Dr. Berger. That's his approach to his therapeutic clients. Meet them where they're at, not where they think they're at, not where you think they're at, not where you want them to be, not where they want to be, where they're at. Try to find out where they're at. It's critically important. I made the distinction between a sponsor and a step guide. Ideally, they should be the same person. It would be wonderful. In my case, it wasn't. We don't have any rules about any of this. There are no rules. Bill said the only 2 disciplines are God and alcohol. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. That's that dimmer switch concept. The dimmer switch is either going up toward the light or down toward the darkness. And based on Harry Tebow's comments, it's hardwired to go backwards. That's why Bill says we're not cured, we have a daily reprieve. We need to lean gently into that dimmer switch, staying with the metaphor. Lean gently against the dimmer switch, pushing it forward with 10, 11, and 12. Otherwise, if we rest on our laurels, words from the big book, meaning If we rely on past experience or become complacent, that dimmer switch will go down so subtly we won't know it's going down until we're back in the darkness of relapse. That the person be confidential and trustworthy. I hear so many times, well, I can't tell my sponsor that, or I'm intimidated by my sponsor, or my sponsor doesn't have time. Well, get a new sponsor. Your life is on the line. No, literally, not the quality of your life. The very life itself is on the line. Don't settle for less, but know what you expect. And in early recovery, we don't know what we expect. So it's really incumbent on the sponsor to know what is to be expected, to share their experience. People who finish the workshop, I tell them, don't try to be Herb, try to be yourself. Share your experience, share your knowledge. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't lean over your skis and get too far over your skis. Stay where you're at. Be who you are and have one thing that you want to do, and that's to help. When I keep that motivation, I just want to help. Then I'm not competing. I'm not parental. I'm not disciplinarian. I'm not even a teacher. When I just really want to help, I share my experience. I won't chase anybody. All right. I'll be responsive to everybody, and I don't fire anybody. There's lots of discussion around that. Some people that I respect very highly have said that I'm disadvantaging somebody if, in fact, I don't cut them loose because they have the fantasy that they have a sponsor, but they're not taking direction, and I may be an impediment. And I go, you know what? If God sends them to me, I don't send them away. I picked that up from Don Pritz out of Denver, who was the man who sponsored the man who took me through the steps the third time. If God sends them, I don't send them away. They go away. My recommendation is that they call me once a week and tell me what they're thinking, feeling, and doing, and that I meet with them once a month, face to face, so that we get that level of connection. Half of them do that, half of them don't. It's up to them. I don't have any rules about it. As I think in this conversation presentation, I really talked a lot about the questions and how important they are. I'm actually pleased with the way I've woven, if that's a word, that question or that commentary about making sure that we're asking them to ask questions. I'm not asking them questions. This is not a teacher-pupil relationship. This is a guide-mentor relationship. I like the image of a lantern. I'm going to go another couple of minutes. The image of a lantern. I shine the light of my experience on the path that I walk, which allows people who are walking the path to walk in the light of my experience, to have their own experience. I'm not interested in you having my experience. I'm interested in you having your experience. I think the key role is accountability partner. Of all the moving parts of AA, I believe that sponsorship is the most important part. I'm not sure I have a slide on that. If it might be next. Yeah, it is. I'm gonna put up a slide for just a minute because it really represents at least my current thinking and my belief, well, for a long time, actually. There's lots of moving parts in the program. Meetings are really crucial. I met my sponsors. I met my step guides, all in meetings. I've been able to meet people in meetings who needed help, and I've been able to give them help. Meetings are really critically important, but they're not the program. Read pages 159 and 160 in the big book. It talks about, in the big book, the original purpose of meetings. weekly so newcomers can bring their problems, all right, regularly so that we can have the fellowship that we want. That's the only, well, one of the few references to the meetings in the big book. Meetings are not the program. The program is in the book. It's a textbook. The textbook contains the precise instructions for the 12 steps. That's the methodology. That's the program of recovery, steps 1 through 9, the program of recovery. Steps 10 through 12 are the program of living, dealing with unmanageability. Prayer, of course, is key because I'm powerless. Service is key because I'm human and I need to have a sense of contribution to the people around me. But sponsorship, notice it's even in a different color. I believe that's the most important moving part, because if you have an effective relationship with an experienced sponsor, you'll do all the other moving parts. You'll do all the other moving parts. A sponsor is a person who is a sounding board, accountability partner, and who you resonate with. I really just love that word because that was my experience with the man who took me through the steps the first time. My magnet pointed north. It was a phenomenal experience. Not that everybody will have that. I was able to choose other people to be my step guides in prayer and trust that that would be presented to me. Do they have what you want in terms of their sobriety, and are they enjoying it? Their sobriety. Are they enjoying their life? If you want to have a role model for relationships and work and the life on principles, the positive attitude and useful and stability, those are things that you might want to be looking for, but know what you're looking for in a sponsor, and the transparency is really important. If you've kept a secret from your sponsor, you probably don't have the right sponsor, or you certainly don't have a healthy relationship. From my standpoint, the sponsor is a person with whom you have a transparent relationship. I asked the man who asked me to be transparent, my first sponsor, and he said, that means to have your insides and your outsides match. My step guides also knew what they knew, and they knew what they didn't know. They knew their limits. So if in a step 9 situation, they didn't have that experience, they sent me to somebody else. They weren't attached to their ego, and they weren't attached to me. When I said to my sponsor, I'm going to work the steps with another man. You're my sponsor, but I'm going to work the steps with another man. He said, that's great, Herb. You need all the help you can get. I mean, isn't that wonderful? He had no ego involvement in it. He had no attachment to it. He wanted my best interest. That's another criteria. And for you too. Do you want their best interest? Is that why you're trying to help them? And are you really trying to help them? Mixed motive is okay. Mixed motives, as long as the priority motive is, I just really want to help. And that they be open in the sense of common sense to outside additional resources, medication, therapy, religion, self-help. Those are all powerful resources for people. None of those worked for me in the sense of my addiction and or my human development until I did the steps, but then I've used almost every one of them, the list I just rattled off, during the step process or after the step process to expand my own human development. The best image, and then we'll take some questions. The best image I have is comes from the Buddhist culture, of the Buddhist, the monk, the teacher, standing on a path, pointing the way to the light. That's the sponsor's role, pointing the way to power. I won't even use the term God. It's not necessary. Pointing the way to power. Now, of course, it's a capital P, And there's lots of words in the big book that talk about God and higher power and spirit of the universe, sunlight of the spirit. Wonderful, wonderful poetic images and metaphors. But if step 1 is our experience, a lack of power, then step 12 is a connection to power. And the process in between is the process of connecting to power, the path to power. I'm a lantern. I stand on the path to shine the light on the path. But I point the way. I point the way to the light. If we can keep that, because it's human tendency, and they call it religion, to worship the finger. You've seen some personalities develop cults around them. It's unhealthy. It's very unhealthy. I'm not the light. I'm not the goal. I'm the finger that points the way. All right.
Well, first, thank you, Herb, and thanks again for today. I just wanted to make a comment on, you talked about Wally P. and Back to Basics. So I'm quite familiar with that program and with Wally. And he talks about how, as AA archivist and historian, he found the basis for that, Back to Basics, in the attic of Dr. Bob's house on Ardmore Avenue. And Wally's the first person to say, and he says this often, that this fast approach is just like going to kindergarten. And he says that we have to do this over and over and over again. So he also publishes an interesting 2-page flyer on what came from the same source with the 50 most important passages in the big book to go through with your sponsees, which is kind of interesting for those of us who want some authority or something like that. But Dr. Bob, Wally says, used this approach of the Back to Basics for taking 5,000 people through the steps in the last 10 years of his life.
Yeah.
Which is 1.4 people a day. Yeah, but it worked for him and it kept him sober, which is the whole point. So I could go on and on and on, but I'm sure I have lots of raised hands. So thank you.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Bob and Bill had very different personalities and very different approaches. So there'll be a flavor of difference between the New York early recovery and the Akron early recovery. And there's a vibration of that still locally, certainly in those geographies, as well as in some of the literature. Thanks very much.
Yeah, one additional comment, if I'm still alive, is I like the story we were told about how Bill and Bob went to see AA number 3, Bill Dodson, in the hospital in Akron. And he was, as described in our literature, a real corker. Yes. And it was the first time, he says, that somebody didn't tell him what to do. Yeah. Bill and Bob set the whole program where they just share their experience and strength. And Bill Dodson said, well, if guys like this can do it, then maybe I could also do it. And he left and never drank again.
That's a critical comment. I'm so glad that you made it because it really goes in line with what Bill said about there's only 2 disciplines, God and alcohol. AA and the steps and the sponsor, those are not disciplines. That's right. We share our experience.
My question is from a practical standpoint. I absolutely, when I was writing down my opinions about what is a sponsor, I put down something similar to your saying they have to resonate with you. But it's very hard to find a sponsor who resonates with you because you don't always know ahead of time if that's true. Are there a few questions to ask when you're interviewing a sponsor?
The answer is sure. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. And when I had that experience of resonance, I was 4 years sober. I had been going to a meeting every day, and I had a sponsor that I talked to every day. Now, I believe that allowed me to thaw out sufficiently so that I had some consciousness about what I needed, what I wanted. Not that I was aware of any of this. I'm just looking back over my shoulder. So when I met this man and resonated with him, that was I was available for the experience. I can't believe a newcomer in the first year would ever be open enough, thought out enough to be able to think through or make those decisions or have any criteria at all. So it's really about, do they have what you want? Do they have something that maybe it's just the way they're built, or maybe they drive a Mercedes, or maybe they have a gorgeous counterpart, or maybe they have a great job, or whatever. They have what you want, or especially, of course, they have 5 years of sobriety, or 1 year of sobriety, or 20 years of sobriety. That kind of might impress you. But I think you go with some very, by today's standards anyway, mine and yours, superficial standards in the beginning. And the questions I would want people to ask is, what are your expectations? I mean, I don't know whether they would have the personal sense of ego enough to ask that. Do you go to meetings? Have you worked all of the steps and finished your 9th step? Wow, that would be a powerful question, very confrontational. And it will also limit the field. How many people actually have finished the 9th step? Have you had a spiritual awakening? I mean, that would be so confrontational. That would be a really hard question, even for an experienced person to ask. But maybe you ask it of yourself. Can they talk about what changes, or maybe that's another question. What changes have you experienced since you've been sober? That would be a wonderful question. All right. Mm-hmm. Or what's your expectation of a sponsee? How do you sponsor? What are your requirements? Those are kind of some basic stuff. It's an interview. Mm-hmm. The sponsor's interviewing the sponsee, but the sponsees really should be, in the ideal sense, interviewing the sponsor. Now, of course, this is all theoretical, and it's all sort of the ideal, because when you come down, for instance, I heard for the first probably 3 years in the program, give your name and number to people. I did that. I think I had one call in 3 years. Nobody calls. I mean, a newcomer, they're going to call a perfect stranger. So once I did the steps, what I heard was, oh, get their number and call them. Well, that's a totally different thing. That's why at the beginning of my talk today, I talked about being proactive based on what Bill did and what Bob did. They reached out. They didn't wait for people to come to them. They didn't go to a meeting, all right, because there weren't any. They went to the hospitals. They went to the jails. They went to the asylums. They went to where sick people are. Well, now we can go to meetings, because in fact, my interpretation, tongue in cheek, with a nice sense of humor, my interpretation of a AA meeting is the outpatient department of the mental hospital. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for laughing.
Thanks, Herb.
Thank you, Herb. This was really wonderful, and also to hear the history. And over the years of sponsoring people, I have a question about non-conference approved literature and being with sponsees. For about 25 years, I've been reading Bill's letter after we finished the 12 steps, and I've been reading that to sponsees and having them inventory their demands and the emotional, pools underneath. It's been life-setting, and also in their 4 steps to see what defects come out of unmet demands. So Alan Berger comes out with his book, and it's like, I've met a soulmate, right? And this has helped me so much in my recovery, and I'm trying to pass it on. And my vision is I'd like to do a book study with all of them together, but it is, and I've suggested it to people, and I've sent your and his video out, because that's what first turned me on to all of this, is your video during Founders Day a couple of years ago. So grateful. So anyway, the other person that's made a huge difference in my life and how I think is Byron Katie. And I know you've mentioned her too, and just accepting reality, the lies and the truth. It's another form of inventory. So I've woven that in. And I suggest the book every once in a while, but I don't do like a full court press, nor do I do a book study. Do you have a way that you incorporate other literature in that? I don't know. In the beginning, I was like, it's only conference approved, only conference approved.
Oh,
but,
yeah. Well, it depends on.
I love those two books. I love those.
It depends on what your purpose is. What are you trying to accomplish? I know lots of people that do the workshop. They facilitate or co-facilitate a workshop on the big book, the way I do it. And in fact, many of them use my recordings and my books as a support, although they use the big book as the textbook that they go through the steps with. They use the others as supplemental suggested material. But once they finish that cohort of people has such a connection with one another, a bond, that they can, okay, so what should we do next? And they'll pick one of the books that you just talked about. And they say, well, let's do this book. This is not a 12-step meeting. This is a meeting of people who are interested in human development at the very least, and spiritual awakening at the very most. I mean, we don't have to talk about, quote, conference approved, because this isn't a conference approved group. This is just a group of people getting together for a common purpose.
Okay, that's a great way to separate it, keep it separate. And then it could be voluntary for who wants to come.
Exactly.
And who doesn't want to come. Okay.
Yeah.
Some people aren't ready. I really think that it's a way of thinking that, I don't know, some people aren't ready to hear until they experience something and want to go deeper in it. And so, and then they're ripe for it. So I want to share the message.
As long as, yes, all of that, as long as, number one, you keep the 12-step program clean, singleness of purpose.
Right. Okay.
And your own personal and or group development separate. So I do not incorporate a study of any book other than the big book and the 12 and 12 in my workshop.
Okay.
But I mentioned lots of other books. You just rattled off some of them as I'm going through, because I have like Bill, a total all-inclusive attitude.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah. But you figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. That's all. And keep the 12-step culture within the scope of the traditions, and then anything else you want to do, just make sure that you're clear on the primary purpose.
Yeah, I think both of them are companions, but I don't want to bleed them together. They both are assets to it, but I don't want to. I think that's great advice. So thank you so much.
Well, yeah, because as soon as you start, and I've seen it ruin some really good meetings where they start bringing in outside literature, then it becomes competitive, and then it becomes diluted, and then it becomes new agey, or it's kind of like, oh, you do one thing for a good reason, but it's a little bit off of principle, and then it deteriorates. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
so much.
I have a question about that interim period of when somebody comes to a meeting, as someone did to my meeting today. I'm secretary of a women's meeting, and she was completely in a terrible mess about the consequences of her destructive drinking. She was a wreck. She had just relapsed, and when I asked, is there anyone newcomers, and she said she has a desire to stop drinking. She has just one day. And I think you know that my calling is facilitating steps. I'm not a sponsoring type. I am more of a step, guiding people through the steps. And because she was a newcomer, I knew who she was. I ran the meeting. We talked about step one, and there's step one is not in the 12 and 12 is not such a big chapter, so we could hash it up. But halfway through, I realized that not a word I said reached her, because I was somewhere else. I was there maybe with all the information. And how do you reach a person who comes in completely broken and devastated and a wreck with steps, with a program?
Yeah.
If you're not a sponsor, I don't know.
No. First, if it's a group meeting, you let them be. You just let them be. If they want to speak, they will. And if they don't speak, it's because they didn't want to. And if you call on them, it's a potential for embarrassment. So I wouldn't call on them. But on an individual basis, I would ask them some questions about what do they want and et cetera, like that. And the best part for new people is a structure. And that's why I think my sponsor said, go to a meeting every day. Now, I don't give that recommendation. To a brand new person, I would say it's really highly helpful if you, for 60 to 90 days, if you do go to a meeting every day, because you begin to get some new habits. You begin to connect to some information and to some experience and to some people in the community. And then the people that have the most success with newcomers are very structured groups and very structured sponsors, because new people really need structure and accountability, and knowing that they're not going to, quote, do what you're told, but that there's an accountability there, that you have given them some information and some suggestion to do, and let them know that these are potentially acts contrary to their will, that they might not agree with it, they might not want to do it, they might not feel like doing it, but it's important for them to take direction and to follow the direction just because you said it. Now, that has a total slippery slope of creating tyrants of sponsorships, and you've seen it before, which is very unhealthy. I don't mean it in the disciplinarian sense or in the control sense, not at all. I mean it in the beginning to take behavior that's different than their normal behavior. It's science now. It used to just be spirituality and maybe common sense, but now it's science. Dan Siegel is a psychiatrist at UCLA, a researcher in the brain, and he's written many books, but one of his conclusions is the brain changes when you do something, not when you know something, not when you feel something. The brain changes when you do something. So he said the formula is do it, and then you'll know it and you'll feel it. Which, of course, is exactly what you heard from the wise sponsors in the rooms. It doesn't matter what you think, and it doesn't matter how you feel. It does matter what you do. And when you do differently, you will think differently and feel differently. So it's really good science now. And somehow you have to communicate that, maybe without all the words I just used, but somehow communicate it to the person that it's really important that they begin to take actions that they don't believe in and they don't want to do, but that they do it anyway. And then make it really small and incremental. Don't make it huge for them to be jumping over high hurdles. It's just the little hurdles, so make it easy. That's why the sponsor said, go to a meeting every day, call me every day. Wonderful. I didn't understand why he said it, but he also said, when you go to the meeting, go 10 minutes early and stay 10 minutes after, so that you can become part of the community, because when you're there, reach out, helps. You know, maybe you wash we had ashtrays and porcelain cups in the day. Maybe you do that after the meeting. I'm really busy. Yeah, let's try it, Herb. Well, what happened is I became part of. I was helping out, so people knew that I was serious, and we connected, and I felt part of. And when I went there, I felt connected. Great question. Yeah. You know, there's lots of questions about, well, what about friends? What about family? Not a good idea. You might become friends with a sponsee or a sponsor, and that'll happen because of the intimacy of the activity. But I don't believe that you should start out having a sponsorship relationship, either up or down, with a friend. Because what you want is somebody who's going to tell you the truth, regardless of whether it hurts your feelings or not. That's my definition of a real clean relationship in direction. Family members, it's kind of the same thing. Should it be a comfortable, we used the term earlier, resonate. That's not comfortable. I was intimidated by this man. He was taller than me. He was clearly smarter than me. He was clearly more successful than me, and he was clearly meaner than me. All right. I was very intimidated, but there was something in here that was like the magnet I mentioned. And so it doesn't have to be a comfortable relationship. Although it can't be obviously a totally uncomfortable relationship. Well, maybe it can be in the beginning. What about more than one relationship? So if you're in AA, do you have an Al-Anon sponsor? Yeah, probably. If you're in AA, do you have a food sponsor? Yeah, probably. But if you have multiple addictions, do you have multiple sponsors? I don't think so, because the addiction is different, but the solution is the same. Unmanageability is the problem, and the spiritual solution is a relationship with power. There's some protocol differences and some differences in substance and process addiction, but we don't need to spread ourselves out too thin. I believe that, at least long-term. Short-term, maybe, just to get a feel of the vocabulary and the identification with the particular variety of addictions.
I'm wondering about your opinion, and just that, on how much information a sponsor should disclose to their sponsee about their own past. Because when people go to speak at meetings, they tend to qualify right off the bat.
Yeah.
To prove to everybody, yeah, I'm an alcoholic. Here's some of the things that happened, and that. But so
it's more from identification standpoint. The qualification is for identification, so that somebody might say, "Oh, they're telling my story, and look at that, they've improved. Maybe that'll work for me." That's the whole point of it. But your question is right on the money. How much should you tell them? As much as is helpful.
Okay.
I've been with people who only want to talk about themselves. It's horrible. It's horrible. My eyes roll back in my head.
Yeah.
It's just horrible. No, it's about what will be helpful. And as I said in the beginning, and really emphasized today, is asking the questions, because they want to talk about themselves. They want to talk about their problems. And that's exactly what you want to do. Yeah. Because actually, when they talk about themselves and their problems in the sounding board of you, they're going to hear themselves differently. Especially if you then ask a couple supplemental questions that zeroes right in on it, and they'll go, "Well, I never made that connection before." Yeah. So that's a very important question. How much do you tell them? Enough that's helpful, enough that stimulates them to trust you, have confidence in you, and be vulnerable with you.
I had a couple of things. One was an observation. When I first got sober, I had no idea of any kind of questions to ask the sponsor.
Yes.
I was in such a fog, and I got sober when I was teaching at a military base in Germany. And so the meetings mostly consisted of men. And so I finally was introduced to Master Sergeant, a woman who was Al-Anon, and she became my sponsor. And I just needed to be led. I had
Yes.
no idea that I was, it might be good for me to, I knew I should go to meetings, but I didn't know that I should get a big book, just really basic things. So I was very,
Exactly. No, we're clueless.
yeah, clueless, definitely. The next thing I was going to ask you a question about one of my sponsees, but in listening to your responses to other people, I kind of realized what I need to do. She's a person that is bipolar and stuck in her story. She loves telling about all her diagnoses and, what's wrong. And I can't seem to move her beyond that. But in listening to you talk with other people, I think I was asking her to do too much at once. And I was just thinking maybe instead of introducing herself as I'm bipolar, I am a woman on the road of recovery and discovery or something like that, something smaller to break out of that story of being stuck.
Well, yes, all of that, changing the vocabulary is really important to the beginning of the reframing. But what happened to me was doing step 4 out of the big book with this man. And he did it incrementally. All right, small little pieces. And as I went through each of the pieces over about a 4 to 6 month period of doing step 4, I ended up becoming very aware that my story was a lie. He couldn't have said that to me at the beginning, but he incrementally took me through each of the pieces of the step 4 out of the big book and expanded it a little bit in terms of his interpretation and experience. And at the end of it, my spiritual awakening happened in step 4. My very first at 4 years of sobriety, the first time going through the steps out of the big book, 4 years of sobriety, that's when my life changed. The spiritual awakening is, oh my God, my story's a lie. I'm not a victim, I'm a perpetrator. I'm not a Renaissance man. I'm a Neanderthal. Oh man, was it embarrassing. But he didn't change my story. He helped me on a path incrementally, asking questions where I was supplying my answers to it based on the big book's instructions. And I was given the gift of a reframing of the story.
Yeah.
And,
Thanks, Herb.
Well, the frustrating part for all of us who have had the reframing is that it takes so goddamn long.
Right.
It's so slow. And yet I had a man, and I mentioned it during my presentation, that took 5 years to do his 4th step. And he, at the end of finishing his 9th step, he said, I needed every year of that.
Right.
He said, I'd had 10 sponsors before I met you. He was 10 years sober when he met me. He had a sponsor every year, and they fired him because he wouldn't meet their time schedule. I said, I have no time schedule. Yours. It's your path. All right. He took 5 years to do his 4th step. But then he finished his 9th step and had to change the story for a different day. And he thanked me for just helping him navigate based on his pace, not mine.
Right.
That's a very important question. Thank you so much for asking it.
One of the things that has been my biggest challenge of my life in emotional sobriety has been having a daughter who is bipolar with schizoid tendencies, who had a psychotic break.
Wow.
It has been the hardest thing I've ever dealt with to have her get help and whatever. But I also, when I'm talking in a meeting or I'm sharing with a sponsee, it's part of my story and part of my experience and how I get through different things. I use it as an example, but I also want to be sympathetic to her privacy, her own story,
Oh,
but
yeah.
it's also my experience on my side of how I got through certain issues and problems and demands and whatever to share. So I really don't know the line. Well, I sometimes do, but then it goes one way or I don't know. But I'd like to see what you have to say about what is the line between what I share about myself, but it affects somebody else, or it's her story too. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question is. So could you condense it and ask just the question?
If I'm sharing with the sponsee and it's an example from, I don't know, a 4-step or something that they're going through, and my biggest experiences is working through issues with my daughter,
Yes.
and sometimes with Al-Anon too, because in Families Anonymous, but I will use her as an example. Like this is a demand I had about her, or this is what
Okay.
she did.
So it's a person, you're sharing a personal experience. The potential, I think, first of all, yes, absolutely. Personal experiences and your story help people to identify not only that you're human and have issues, you're not a sponsor that's a saint, all right? And that's important though for people. It allows them to, oh, they're just like me, and I can be more vulnerable. The problem though, and I heard a hint of mint in it as you were sharing it, how wrapped up are you in your story? Because it might be that's like having blinders on your way that you attempt to help, is you're only looking through the filters of this very limited experience that you have, which may not be that relevant. So I'd be careful that pardon?
To what they're going through.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, it also limits your range of pulling on experiences that might actually be more relevant. Because when you only have a hammer, everything is a nail.
Right. And it was like this. I'm working
Well,
on.
That's what I heard in the energy with which you presented it, actually. Yeah. Gandhi said, be the change that you want to impact. And also Augustine, I believe, said, wherever you are in the world today, preach the good news. Now, the word gospel is translated as good news. So that's what he was talking about. Wherever you are, preach the gospel. He was a 4th century Catholic bishop, and he was preaching the Christian scripture and evangelization and conversion. So having said all of that, sort of transcend that and listen to the words. Wherever you are in the world, preach the good news. If you have to use words. Perfect.
In the beginning of this, you said, I want you to hear this. I want you to hear this to all of us. When there is a problem, I am not part of the problem. I am the entire problem. And I wondered if you could illustrate that. I get it, but I think there's a piece that's still murky, and I really want to get that. Okay, because there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the earth, and to say I am the problem. Yeah,
but the bad stuff going on in the world is irrelevant to my reaction to it. My reaction to it is the problem.
Right. So we're not negating the intensity of harm done to humans.
Not at all.
Okay.
Reality, I mean, as the guy who wrote the road less traveled, he said the very first line, life is difficult. Yeah, life is really difficult. But my reaction to it is the key. Read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
I have read it. It's been
all right, but what's the primary lesson of that book?
His whole experience in a concentration camp was his reaction, his response to every second going on.
It almost couldn't be a worse situation. He's in a death camp. All right.
Yeah.
And he said, I have no control, very little influence. The only thing I can influence is my attitude about it all. He's responsible for his thoughts. He's responsible for his emotions. He's responsible for his behavior, 100%.
Okay, so when we get into addiction and we're actually killing ourselves, I mean, and if we're chronic, our own hand is the murderer. Our own hand is the murderer.
Finish your question.
When we, okay, I'm not sure if I did finish. Okay, so I'll just go over it. When we are a chronic bulimic, chronic alcoholic, and our own hand is the murderer, I just wondered if we could get a little closer to the fire on that. In that, so what is my question? It's not clear.
Well, what's the solution? No, wait, you're screwed.
Yeah, right.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I mean, that's not in the big book, but it's a synthesis. All right. You're powerless. You have no choice. Except, what is your choice? What's the solution?
I show up for this. I read the big book.
That's good. Yes, I show up. That's good.
I show up.
But what do you hope for by showing up for this, or showing up for the steps, or showing up for a 12-step meeting, or finishing the steps? What do you hope for?
For an on fire, passionate relationship with God, so then I can turn around and help other people that
That's
people
right.
have not wanted to work with. Okay.
See? Yep, that's it right there.
Okay.
It's a two-sided coin. It's a two-sided coin. A passionate relationship with God on one side, and a passionate delivery of help on the other side. That's it.
Okay. Okay. So I'm believing, even though the evidence as if yet ain't too great, I believe and I act
All right.
for life, even though
Yep.
death
Do
seems
you have a
okay.
sponsor?
I do,
Good.
Herb, and I thank you for taking my question very much, and everyone listening.
No, it's so on the money, and it's so wonderful at the conclusion of our workshop to be talking that way, because that's where we're going with this. Steps 11 and 12. All right. Step 10 is embedded in step 11, because inventory and meditation go together, but 11 and 12 are the two sides of the spiritual coin. Bill summarized it in the big book. We keep our head in the clouds and our feet on the ground. It's a great image. Step 11, we keep ourselves connected to the world of spirit, but let's be practical. We keep our feet walking on the ground, helping people around us. And of course, that's well, you may or may not know this, but you've probably heard it from me. That's the formula for happiness. I read a lot of books 3 years ago, 4 years ago, in preparation for a workshop I was asked to do on happiness. And I didn't realize that it's a big subject for the last 20 years. And many of the research universities have had their psychologists and scientists looking at what is it that the formula that creates happiness for people. And I read Buddhist literature and Jewish literature and Christian literature and psychologist literature, and the answer was all the same when you distilled it down. Happiness is not a product, it's a byproduct. Anybody who wants to be happy, that's their primary goal, will never be happy. It's startling. If it's your primary purpose, you'll never be happy, because it's so self-centered. But it's a byproduct. And they said it's a byproduct of having a meaning broader than ourselves and a contribution to humanity around us. A meaning broader than ourselves. Think step 11 from my standpoint. Or a contribution to the people around us, obviously step 12. The Buddhists talk about wisdom and compassion. Wisdom, a sense of meaning, a context. Compassion, a sense of helping. In fact, their equivalent to sponsorship is called bodhisattva, which is the person who will not be enlightened. They refuse to be enlightened until everybody in the world is enlightened. It's a cool concept. in my second book, I have Sam Shoemaker, who was the head of the Oxford group, wrote a poem called I Stand by the Door. If you have my book, you should read it. Or if you want to look it up on Google, Sam Shoemaker, I Stand by the Door. And it's like, he's an Episcopal leader of the Oxford group. And he wrote this poem that when he goes to heaven, he's going to stand by the door. He's not going to go into heaven until he has ushered everybody into heaven. It's the same bodhisattva concept. That's why this work is so meaningful, because it's organic. At first we do help because we've been told to help, but later on we catch fire. Like somebody was talking about, Judith was talking about that passionate enlightenment, that awakening, that change, that radical freedom that we get. And then, oh my God, we're on fire with it, because like we're holding the grail, the holy grail. And we can bring it to other people so simply, not evangelical, but intensely sometimes, passionately, all the time. But that's why I like the lantern. I shine light on the path, and people who are looking to be on the path or see the light and want to be on the path can walk the path in the light of my experience to have their own experience. Pretty powerful stuff.
I have a question. Is there a difference between sponsoring an alcoholic and a drug addict?
I don't know that because I've only sponsored alcoholics. I don't sponsor anybody outside of my fellowship because I'm not qualified. I don't have the experience. And I would say, so there might be a difference in terms of yes, I'm sure there's a difference in the ways people sponsor, because for instance, I've been exposed now a lot to the food addicts in about at least 8 different 12-step programs that deal differently with food. And the sponsors all have all different protocols for defining abstinence, for defining tools, for defining relationships with the fellowship and with the sponsors. So yeah, I would say that there will be differences for sponsorship in different fellowships. Yes, I hadn't thought about it before, but I think that's correct.
Okay, I agree. I've not been able to sponsor a drug addict. I have no idea, what an 8-ball does, what drugs do to these people's mind.
No, sponsorship. Now, I've taken people through the steps who are not alcoholic. I've taken people through the steps who are not in any addiction program, and they don't need to be in any 12-step program, but they are on a very serious spiritual path, and they want to apply the 12 steps so that they can have an additional experience with the 12 steps to foster their spiritual life. All right. So that's just a supplement to your question. All right, let's pray the prayer of St. Francis. I think I have it here someplace. There we go. So this is the prayer of transformation that St. Francis is alleged to have written. Of course, he didn't. This prayer appeared in the 18th century, and Francis was in the 12th or 13th century. But it captures his spirit, this humility of traveling a path to help people. This is the path of the 12 steps. This is the path of the final 3 steps. This is our way of life, this turning from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. We need to change in order to communicate the change. And then in communicating the change, we change some more. To the extent that I pay attention to my 11th step, I grow in consciousness. To the extent that I pay attention to the 12th step, my life flourishes. It's counterintuitive, It's paradoxical, but that's the spirit of this prayer. Lord, make me a channel of your peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, that where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is doubt, I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there are shadows, I may bring light, that where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds. It is by forgiving that one is forgiven. It is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Amen. Many of you have heard me talk about Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now. He has a great line in there that just supports all of this, of course. Truth is truth is truth. The secret to life is to die before you die and realize there is no death. That's the journey we're on. Thanks, everybody.